The Smith family had always been close-knit, a typical suburban household where love and laughter filled the air, or so it seemed. The protagonist, Thomas, was the dependable son who never strayed from the path of responsibility. He worked diligently as a financial consultant, always striving to secure a stable future for himself and his loved ones. His younger brother, Marcus, on the other hand, was the wild card, reckless, impulsive, and often swept away by his latest schemes. Marcus had always been the black sheep of the family. Growing up, Thomas had always tried to steer Marcus in the right direction. He'd cover for him during times of trouble, but it seemed nothing could curb Marcus's impulsive nature. Their parents, Eleanor and George, were aware of the growing tension between the brothers, but hoped time would teach Marcus the importance of hard work and responsibility. Unfortunately, their sudden and unexpected death left their sons with no opportunity for reconciliation. The will was a clear-cut affair. Everything would be divided between the two brothers, but when Thomas opened the envelope, his heart sank. Marcus had stolen the bulk of the inheritance, leaving Thomas with a mere fraction of what was rightfully his. The betrayal cut deep, not just because of the money, but because of the trust shattered between them. Thomas had worked tirelessly throughout their childhood, supporting Marcus whenever he faltered, only to be blindsided by this act of greed. The inheritance wasn't just a sum of money, it was a testament to their parents' hard work, the legacy they hoped would be shared between their sons. To Marcus, it was merely an opportunity to live out his next big gamble. Thomas tried to confront him, but Marcus, always quick with a defense or excuse, denied any wrongdoing. The emotional rift that followed felt like a chasm, and Thomas, heartbroken and betrayed, decided to sever ties with his brother. The family's once warm and loving dynamic was replaced with cold distance and resentment. As the years passed, the wound festered, and Thomas moved on, building his life and career. He put the past behind him, telling himself that the betrayal was just a sign of Marcus's true character. But then, one fateful night, everything changed. Marcus, now a shell of the man he once was, reached out to Thomas, desperate and broken, with nothing left to his name, and facing the dire consequences of his choices. Marcus begged Thomas to save him, just as he had so many times in the past. The stage was set. The brother who had stolen from him was now pleading for his help, forcing Thomas to confront a moral dilemma that would test his sense of loyalty, forgiveness, and love. The morning Thomas discovered the truth about his brother's betrayal began like any other. He had been working late the night before, sorting through the financial documents that had been left to him after his parents' passing. With a steady hand, he sifted through their personal papers, hoping to find a clearer picture of their affairs, a way to handle the family estate properly and start rebuilding the legacy they had left behind. But what he found was far from the calm, orderly process he had imagined. It was a simple letter, one he hadn't noticed before. His parents' attorney had sent it weeks ago, but in the chaos of their passing, Thomas had overlooked it. As he scanned the document, a cold knot formed in his stomach. The letter contained a detailed breakdown of the inheritance, and what it revealed shook him to his core. The signature on the will was legitimate, but there were discrepancies in the amounts distributed. It wasn't just an error, it was a deliberate manipulation. Marcus had not only forged signatures, but had also manipulated the documentation to ensure he would inherit the lion's share of the family wealth. Thomas felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. His hands shook as he read the letter again, but the evidence was undeniable. Marcus had hired a lawyer to alter the terms of the will shortly before their parents' death, ensuring that he would get everything. The most crushing part wasn't the wealth, it was the realization that his brother had stolen from him with such cunning and malice. All of the years of hard work and sacrifice, the moments when Thomas had put his own life on hold to care for their family, now seemed meaningless in the face of his brother's betrayal. For a moment he sat frozen, staring at the papers. His mind reeled, trying to make sense of what had happened. His first instinct was to confront Marcus, to demand an explanation. But what would he say? How could Marcus justify such a cold, calculated betrayal? How could someone who once claimed to love him do something so vile? The confrontation came 2 days later. Thomas had gathered all the evidence he could find. The forged documents, the lawyer's records, everything. He confronted Marcus in the family home, the place where they had both grown up. It was a strange, tense moment. There was an eerie silence between them as Thomas held up the papers. His heart pounded in his chest as he saw his brother standing there, his usual cocky grin replaced with a nervous twitch in his eye. "Marcus, we need to talk," Thomas said. his voice steady, but filled with an underlying fury. I know what you did. You stole from me, stole from both of us. You forged those documents, didn't you? For a moment, Marcus said nothing. He simply stared at the papers, a flicker of panic crossing his face before he quickly masked it with a casual shrug. What are you talking about? What papers? Don't play dumb, Thomas snapped, slamming the papers down on the table. This is the inheritance, Marcus. The one you've been lying about. You manipulated the will, forged signatures. You took everything that was meant to be shared between us. Marcus finally spoke, his tone defensive, but it lacked its usual confidence. It's not like that, Thomas. You don't understand. I needed this, I deserve this. You don't get it. I've always been the one who struggled. I'm the one who had to fight for everything. You've always had it easy. Mom and Dad loved you more, hell. You're the golden child. I was always the screw-up. I just took what I was owed. Thomas was livid. The nerve of Marcus to try and justify this theft with a tirade about perceived favoritism was almost too much to bear. He had always been the responsible one, always there for their parents when they needed help, always the one to pick up the slack. He had worked countless hours, paid bills, taken care of their home, and yet Marcus was the one who had been spoiled, never having to answer for his actions. You think you were owed this? Thomas's voice was thick with anger. You've taken everything from me. This wasn't about what you deserved, Marcus. It was about trust. I trusted you, and you took advantage of that. Marcus's eyes flickered, and for a brief moment, Thomas thought he might see some remorse. But instead, his brother's face hardened. I didn't take anything from you. You weren't going to do anything with it anyway. You're boring, Thomas. You think about everything so logically. This was my chance to live. You've always been a slave to responsibility. I'm just doing what I had to do to survive. The words hit like a slap, and in that moment, everything Thomas had ever done for Marcus seemed meaningless. He had protected him, sacrificed his own happiness, but none of that had mattered. It wasn't enough. Marcus had stolen from him and justified it in the most selfish way imaginable. The confrontation escalated quickly, and soon they were shouting at each other. Marcus's accusations grew more venomous, blaming Thomas for everything wrong in his life, even though Thomas had always tried to help him. The years of resentment, of bitterness that had simmered beneath the surface, finally exploded. I should have known, Thomas said, shaking his head. I should have known you were capable of this. You've always been nothing but selfish. You only care about yourself. I hope you're happy with what you've done. With those words, Thomas turned and walked out of the house. He felt numb, the weight of betrayal crushing him, but the sense of justice burning hot in his chest. He had nothing left. The inheritance was gone, the relationship shattered, and all that remained was the cold realization that his brother had taken it all, the wealth, the stat, everything. But more than anything, he felt hollow. Marcus had stolen more than just money. He had stolen a part of their shared past, a connection that could never be repaired. As the days passed, Thomas tried to move on. He focused on his work, tried to find peace in the life he had rebuilt. But the pain of what his brother had done never truly went away. It lingered in the corners of his mind, a constant reminder of the trust he had placed in the wrong person. Marcus, on the other hand, seemed to thrive in the wake of his betrayal. He spent lavishly, living a life filled with excess, never once considering the consequences of his actions. He was living his dream, free from responsibility, but at what cost? The emotional fallout was undeniable. The brothers were no longer family, they were strangers, bound only by blood but torn apart by betrayal. Thomas was left to rebuild his life, while Marcus reveled in the wealth he had stolen, blind to the destruction he had caused. The initial days after the confrontation were quiet, almost eerily so. For Thomas, the shock of his brother's betrayal still lingered like a heavy fog in his mind. He had begun rebuilding his life, focusing on his work, his career, and his future. But the weight of the emotional damage Marcus had inflicted on him refused to dissipate. Every success he achieved, every step forward in his career, felt hollow, as though a part of him had been taken away. No matter how hard he tried to move forward, he couldn't escape the haunting memory of his brother's betrayal. Meanwhile, Marcus seemed to be thriving in the wake of the inheritance. At first glance, it appeared as though his reckless lifestyle was paying off. He quickly moved into a grand mansion, throwing extravagant parties and making lavish purchases. The money flowed freely as he indulged in everything he had ever dreamed of: luxury cars, designer clothes, a world of excess, an indulgence that he had always envied from the sidelines. But as the weeks turned into months, it became increasingly clear that Marcus was squandering his newfound wealth. He didn't know the first thing about managing money, and his spending habits were impulsive at best. He was seduced by the thrill of living like a millionaire, buying things he didn't need just because he could. The business ventures he had invested in hoping to multiply his wealth were nothing more than scams and high-risk schemes. He had ignored the warnings of those who tried to advise him, believing that money could solve all his problems. In a few short months, the money that had once seemed endless began to dwindle away. Marcus's failed investments bled him dry. His business ventures turned sour, and his lifestyle choices caught up with him. He had invested in a chain of luxury hotels in a foreign country, but the deal fell apart when the local government seized the property for fraud. His real estate investments tanked, and his attempts at starting a tech startup were no better riddled with shady partners and questionable business practices. By the time Marcus realized he was in trouble, it was already too late. His debts began to mount, creditors hounding him at all hours, threatening legal action. The mansion he had once been so proud of became a burden, and the luxury cars he'd flaunted were now just expensive reminders of the lifestyle he could no longer afford. The friends he had partied with, those who had once admired his wealth and success, slowly disappeared as quickly as they had appeared. Marcus found himself isolated, his social standing slipping away, as those who had once seen him as a rising star now turned their backs on him. Without the wealth and status, Marcus was nothing. The carefree attitude that had once defined him was replaced by desperation. His calls for help went unanswered, and the world he had built around him crumbled. Gone were the days of lavish parties, of basking in admiration and envy. Now all he had was a mountain of debt, a tarnished reputation, and an overwhelming sense of regret. For a brief time, he tried to maintain the illusion that everything was fine. He continued to post on social media, posting pictures of his lavish lifestyle in an attempt to keep up appearances, but it was a facade that crumbled as quickly as his wealth. His followers on social media dwindled, his business contacts stopped returning his calls, and his friends abandoned him. His entire identity had been built on wealth and status, and now that those things were gone, so was he. The desperation in Marcus grew with every passing day. The walls were closing in on him. His debts mounted, creditors threatening to seize everything he had left, including his remaining assets. He knew he was on the brink of losing it all: the mansion, the cars, the life he had once thought he was entitled to. But what troubled him more than anything was the realization that he had lost something far more precious: his brother. Thomas had long since moved on, or so it seemed. He had built a solid career for himself, his business thriving, his life stable. From the outside, Thomas appeared to be untouched by the chaos Marcus had unleashed. But on the inside, he felt a constant emotional turmoil, torn between anger, betrayal, and a lingering sense of loss. Despite the hurt, despite the shattered trust, there was still a part of him that cared about Marcus. The brother he had once trusted, the brother he had fought for, was now a ghost in his life, someone he couldn't forget, no matter how hard he tried. As Marcus's situation worsened, the toll it took on him became undeniable. The man who had once walked into a room full of confidence now shrank in the shadows, his every step weighed down by regret. He found himself turning to those he had wronged, but there were no second chances to be had. His former business partners, friends, and even some of the family acquaintances had all turned their backs on him. They saw him for what he had become: a fraud, a man who had been blinded by greed and self-interest. Marcus's desperation reached its peak when he could no longer hide from the consequences of his actions. His creditors had tracked him down, threatening legal action that would ruin him completely. His luxurious lifestyle, which had once been a symbol of success, now served as a painful reminder of how far he had fallen. His attempts to find a way out, whether through more risky ventures or desperate pleas for help, only led to more failure. One night, as he sat in his empty mansion, staring at the bills piling up on the desk, Marcus realized the full extent of his mistake. He had destroyed everything: his family, his wealth, his reputation, and for what? The inheritance he had stolen had only provided him with a fleeting moment of happiness, a brief illusion of success, before it all came crashing down. And it wasn't just the money he had lost. He had lost the only person who had ever truly cared about him, Thomas. In his pursuit of wealth and power, Marcus had sacrificed the one thing that mattered most. The realization hit him harder than anything else. The brother he had betrayed, the man who had always been there for him, was now a distant memory. As Marcus sat alone in the darkness, his life falling apart around him, he felt the crushing weight of his actions. He had no one left to turn to. He had burned every bridge, lost everything he had ever valued, and now he was completely alone. The enormity of his mistake was undeniable, and with it came the realization that no amount of money, no luxurious lifestyle, could ever replace what he had thrown away. Marcus was isolated, desperate, and completely broken, an empty shell of the man he once was. And as he faced the reality of his situation, he understood, perhaps too late, that there was no way to undo the damage he had done. The days seemed to blur together for Marcus as his life spiraled further into chaos. He had long ago exhausted every possible avenue, every chance he'd once had to redeem himself. His debts were insurmountable, his businesses in ruins, and his social circle, what little was left of it, had all but disappeared. What remained of his luxurious lifestyle now stood as an empty shell, a stark reminder of how quickly everything could vanish. The mansion that had once been a symbol of his success now felt like a prison. The grand rooms, the polished floors, the expensive furniture all seemed to mock him, reminding him of his foolishness. He had blown through everything: his inheritance, his relationships, his future, and now he was facing the cold, unforgiving reality of his decisions. One night, as Marcus lay on his bed in the darkened mansion, unable to sleep, the weight of his mistakes pressed on him. The constant ringing of his phone from creditors, the threatening letters piling up in the hallway, and the barrage of angry calls from people he once called friends had become unbearable. The lavish parties and carefree nights of the past were nothing but distant memories, replaced by a suffocating silence. The loneliness had become unbearable, and with it came a crushing sense of regret. He had been foolish, blinded by greed and selfishness. He had betrayed the one person who had always had his back, his brother, Thomas. And now it was too late. The reality of his situation settled in. He had nothing left. Marcus knew what he had to do, but the thought of it made his stomach churn. He had no pride left, no sense of dignity. He had already burned every bridge, but there was one last bridge to cross, one person he could turn to, his brother. The thought terrified him. The guilt that had haunted him ever since the day he had stolen Thomas's share of the inheritance seemed insurmountable. How could he face him? How could he ask for forgiveness after everything he had done? But desperation had a way of breaking down even the hardest of walls. The next day, Marcus stood outside Thomas's apartment, his palms sweaty, his heart racing. He had spent hours rehearsing what he would say, but no words seemed right. He had nothing left but the wreckage of his own actions, and now he had to beg for mercy. He hesitated, standing in front of the door for what felt like an eternity, before finally summoning the courage to knock. The door opened, and Thomas stood there, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The years of tension, of unresolved anger, hung heavily in the air. Marcus could see the bitterness in Thomas's eyes, the same bitterness that had been there when they last spoke. But there was something else, too, something softer, more uncertain. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, his voice hoarse. "I've made a mess of everything. I know I don't deserve your help, but I need it. I'm begging you." Thomas stood still, taking in the sight of his brother. Marcus was a shadow of the man he had once been, disheveled, worn down by his own choices. His eyes, once filled with arrogance, now seemed empty, haunted by the weight of his actions. There was no pride left in him, no bravado, only desperation. It was the first time Thomas had seen his brother like this, truly broken. "I don't know if I can do this," Thomas finally said, his voice a mixture of anger and exhaustion. "You took everything from me, Marcus. You stole my inheritance, my future. I don't know how to look at you the same way anymore." Marcus's eyes filled with tears, the pain of his betrayal now cutting deeper than any consequence he faced. I know I ruined everything. I was so stupid, Thomas. I was blinded by greed and I was so selfish. But I've lost everything. And now I don't know who else to turn to. You're the only family I have left." Thomas took a step back, his mind racing. The anger and resentment that had built up over the months since the betrayal surged within him. He had worked so hard for what he had, everything he had achieved. He had built his life from the ground up while Marcus had thrown everything away. Now, the very man who had stolen from him was standing at his door, asking for help. The injustice of it all burned in Thomas's chest, a fire that threatened to consume him. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Thomas said quietly. "You took everything from me, and I don't even know who you are anymore. I don't know if I can forget what you did." Marcus lowered his head, the weight of his brother's words cutting deeper than anything else. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need your help. I'm broken, Thomas. I've lost everything. My reputation, my money, my life. I'm drowning, and I don't know what to do. The silence between them grew thick. Thomas could feel the raw emotion in his brother's words, the vulnerability that had been stripped away by desperation. He had always seen Marcus as someone who was untouchable, someone who could do no wrong. But now, in front of him, Marcus was a broken man, desperate for a lifeline. For a moment, Thomas thought about turning him away. Let him suffer the consequences of his actions. He had worked so hard to move on, to heal from the wounds Marcus had caused. He had built a life that was stable, secure, and free from the chaos his brother had brought into it. But something deep inside him, the part of him that still cared for Marcus, despite everything, hesitated. As he looked at his brother, Thomas felt the weight of their shared history, the years they had spent growing up together, the bond they once had. He had lost so much to Marcus's betrayal, but there was still a part of him that wanted to help. The anger, the betrayal, it was all still there, but beneath it, there was a flicker of compassion, a flicker of love that had never fully extinguished. I don't know what to do, Thomas said, his voice breaking. I'm angry, Marcus. I'm so angry. But I can't just leave you two. I can't leave you like this. You're my brother. I don't know if I can help, but I'll try. Marcus looked up at him, tears welling in his eyes. I don't deserve it. But thank you. Thank you, Thomas. The two brothers stood in silence, the weight of the moment settling over them. Thomas's mind was still clouded with anger and hurt, but there was something else there, too, a faint hope that, perhaps, they could find a way forward. The road ahead would be difficult, the wounds too deep to heal quickly, but in this moment, they both realized that the choice to forgive, or at least to try, was the only path that might lead them both out of the darkness. The tension in the air was palpable, a silent battle raging within Thomas. The weight of the decision before him pressed heavily on his chest. The world outside seemed to stand still, frozen in time, as he stood there, facing his brother Marcus, the man who had once been his partner in crime, his best friend, and his closest ally was now the man who had shattered his life, stolen everything he had worked for. And now, here he was again, standing at Thomas's door, begging for mercy. Marcus was on the edge. His life was in shambles, his every move tracked by creditors and enemies alike. But more than that, his health was deteriorating. Stress had taken its toll, and he had pushed himself to the brink of collapse. His debts had caught up with him, and now, in his moment of desperation, he was asking Thomas for one last chance, a chance to save himself from the mess he had created. I know I've ruined everything, Marcus said, his voice raw. I know I don't deserve your help, but I can't survive this. Not without you. Please, Thomas, I don't have anyone else. You're the only one who can help me. Thomas looked at him, the man he once thought he knew so well, the man who had been his flesh and blood, his companion through all of life's challenges. And yet, in this moment, he felt like a stranger. The man standing before him was not the Marcus he had grown up with. This man was broken, desperate, a shadow of the person he had once been. But beneath the anger and betrayal, Thomas could see something else in his brother's eyes, genuine remorse, a fear that ran deeper than just losing everything. Marcus wasn't asking for a handout, he was asking for a lifeline. For the first time since the betrayal, Thomas could see the raw vulnerability in his brother, the realization that his actions had consequences far beyond what he had imagined. The decision hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Thomas's heart battled with his mind. He had every right to turn his back on Marcus. He had been wronged in the worst possible way, had lost everything because of him. His trust had been shattered, and the bond they once shared felt irreparable. But despite the hurt, despite the betrayal, a part of him still cared. A part of him still remembered the good times, the days when Marcus had been more than just a brother, he had been a friend, a confidant, someone he could trust without question. And now, in this moment, Thomas was faced with the ultimate choice. Should he show mercy, or should he let Marcus face the consequences of his actions alone? I don't know if I can do this, Thomas said, his voice trembling with emotion. You took everything from me, Marcus. Everything I had worked for. You betrayed me in the worst way possible. How can I ever forgive that? Marcus's face crumpled, his eyes filling with tears. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve it. But I'm not asking for forgiveness, Thomas. I'm asking for help. I'm asking you to give me a chance to make things right, even if it's just a small one. Please. Thomas's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The anger was still there, a burning fire that threatened to consume him. But beneath it was something else, something he couldn't ignore. The part of him that wanted to help his brother, to offer him a way out, no matter how impossible it seemed. He could see how much Marcus was struggling, how much he was suffering, and it gnawed at Thomas's conscience. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. I can't just let this go, Marcus. You've hurt me, you've hurt our family, and you've hurt yourself. But I'm not going to watch you destroy yourself either. I'll help you, but on my terms. Marcus's eyes widened in disbelief, as if he hadn't expected any help at all. What do you mean? I mean that you don't get to just waltz back into my life as if nothing happened. You've got to earn back my trust, and that's going to take time. I'm not doing this out of pity. I'm doing this because, despite everything, you're still my brother. But you've got to prove to me that you're willing to fight for your life. You've got to show me that you're capable of responsibility. No more lies. No more shortcuts. You have to face your mistakes. And you have to start by owning up to them. Tears streamed down Marcus's face, and he nodded, overwhelmed by the weight of Thomas's words. I will. I promise. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll prove to you that I can change. I don't care how long it takes. I'll make it right. Thomas nodded slowly, though his heart was heavy with doubt. He wasn't sure if Marcus could change. He wasn't sure if the man standing before him could ever be the person he once was. But he also knew that sometimes people needed a chance, just one chance to redeem themselves. And maybe, just maybe, Marcus could do it. For his own sake, if nothing else. But as the conversation shifted toward practical matters, Marcus's recovery, rebuilding his life, seeking financial counseling, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that things would never be the same between them. No matter how much Marcus tried to make amends, the trust had been broken. The bond, once unbreakable, had been shattered. And even if they repaired the damage, there would always be cracks. The road to redemption was long, and it was uncertain whether Marcus could truly walk it. The sound of Marcus's footsteps echoed in the empty hallway as he walked away from Thomas's apartment. For the first time in years, he felt like he might have a chance to fix things. His brother hadn't forgiven him, not yet, but he had agreed to help. That was something, right? But as he walked down the street, heading back to his broken life, he couldn't escape the nagging doubt that lingered in his mind. Could he change? Was it too late to rebuild the life he had so carelessly destroyed? The answer, as it turned out, came sooner than expected. As the weeks passed, Marcus found that Thomas's help came with conditions, harsh, uncompromising conditions. He was forced to work long hours, to admit to his failures in front of others, to face the consequences of his actions head-on. But for all of that, it still wasn't enough. He still found himself struggling with the weight of his mistakes. The road to redemption was far longer than he had anticipated. In the end, Marcus's relationship with Thomas never truly healed. There was too much pain, too much anger between them. They went their separate ways, each haunted by their past but determined to move forward. For Marcus, the road to redemption remained a lonely one, but one he was willing to walk. And for Thomas, the lesson he learned was clear. Family loyalty, trust, and integrity were priceless, and they were worth more than anything money could buy. The brothers' futures, once so intertwined, became divided. Yet both were determined to find peace in their own way, each struggling with the weight of their choices, but never truly forgetting the bond they had once shared.